Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. In this one, we've got a topic on Linus bidding on our charity auction mod mat with his own autograph on it. We're also talking about Intel expected to cut prices in 2120. Second half, 20, sorry, misread that. Intel's record earnings and some reduction in volume. And then AMD patching security vulnerabilities on its GPUs for shader compilers. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2080 Ti XE Ultra. The 2080 Ti XE Ultra is what we use in our CPU reviews to avoid GPU bottlenecks. The XE Ultra uses hydraulic dynamic bearing fans for reduced noise, features RTX support for DXR titles, and uses a massive 2.75 slot cooler. The cooler design allows the fans to spin slower and quieter while sinking heat, further leveraging a mix of L-shaped and traditional fins to maximize airflow or contact. Learn more at the link in the description below. First one is the charity auction. So we started a charity auction last week where we put up a mod mat that it was from one of the first production runs. It's been signed by a good amount of the YouTubers who we knew at the time 2 years ago when we kind of brought it to a trade show. We put it on eBay and we're donating 100% of the revenue generated from the eBay listing when it sells to a wildlife charity in Australia that's focused on helping wildlife recover from the bushfires. That organization is Wildlife Rescue South Coast. We also have a thing going on our store right now where if you buy stuff like you wanted to buy something anyway, for example, mod mats or one of these shirts that we just put on the store, then we're giving 10% of all the revenue from those sales for the next month or so, split between Adelaide Koala and Wildlife Rescue Hospital, and then the same South Coast charity I mentioned. So, and that's just if you wanted to buy our stuff anyway, then cool, we'll give some of the money. Obviously, if you want to donate directly, then that's even more effective, so just do that if you want to do that. But the charity auction thing, I emailed Linus after his live stream, like immediately after it, caught it while I was working, and you all likely have seen it at this point or are familiar with it. Emailed him, just a massive email. We talked a little bit, none of that really matters, but the thing I wanted to cover here for public coverage is that one of the last things I said in the email was the good news is that the charity auction for the thing that has your signature on it is up to $2,000. That's awesome. And I emailed them 2 hours later and said, bad news, a lot of those bids were removed because people were bidding on it to just artificially increase the price but had no intention of buying it. So please do not do that. If you bid on it and you don't plan to actually buy it if you win, what's going to happen is I don't have a way to give that to the second place person. So if you accidentally win and you don't intend on paying, that screws me over and it screws the charity over because now I have to relist it and we go through this whole process and it takes a long time to go through it all again. So, you know, it adds time to something that really it should just only bid on it if you want it. So anyway, Linus ended up bidding on it. I don't know what his maximum is that he put in there, but it's at $1,600 at time of filming. It dropped from $2,000 to $1,000 when all of the invalid bids were eliminated. And then Linus stepped in and now it's at $1,625. So worst case scenario, Linus buys his own autograph. But if you want to outbid him, go ahead and try. Just please only do it if you actually have the intention to pay for it. All right, so that's all fun. I've got that linked in the description below. Of course, our thanks to Linus for getting involved in even more of a way than I expected him to. And I plan to talk with him at LTX when that comes up again and do some kind of Linus and Steve just talk type of thing like we did last time where we just kind of go off the cuff and have a conversation. So anyway, that's a while from now. Let's get into the show notes. So AMD patches 4 GPU vulnerabilities within the shader compiler. AMD has updated 4 serious vulnerabilities with the latest Adrenalin 2020 edition and the 20.1.1 update, which I think is actually a version behind now. But these are relatively common types of updates to see. NVIDIA recently did its own driver updates to address security vulnerabilities in its GPUs and as related to the drivers. And AMD has done one now. So while AMD has made no mention of these, as of this writing anyway, Talos Intelligence has detailed them extensively. We can go through a short list here. So CVE 2019-5146 says it's an AMD ATI Radeon ATI DXX64.dll, and it says MAD shader functionality denial of service vulnerability. There's another one for the same DLL, and it says MOVC shader functionality denial of service vulnerability, and a shader functionality constant buffer denial of service vulnerability, and then finally shader functionality VTABLE or VTABLE remote code execution vulnerability. The common thread here is the DLL ATI DXX64, which has an exploitable vulnerability that can be manipulated with malicious shader code, and that leverages the entire shader compiler as an attack vector. So those are what's been patched related to this. That attack vector could, in theory, have been used to attack the host machine from a VM, or there's also the possibility of remote code execution. So suffice to say, if you're using AMD GPUs, you might want to consider an update, primarily if you're in a business environment or a small business. And follow the links in our show notes if you want the respective CVE pages for more detail on each individual exploit if you're interested in that type of thing. Next one, Intel record earnings, but some reduction in volume. Intel recently reported its earnings for the previous quarter, overall reporting $72 billion in total revenue, calling it, quote, a record year, and it forecasts $73.5 billion for 2020. There are some negatives caused by AMD, like an overall trend of 6% volume reduction year over year in desktops, 5% volume reduction year over year in notebooks, and 3% volume reduction in servers, where the money is most notable. But Intel's had a strong year overall and is raising its dividend as a result. Of note, Intel had the most growth in its data center segment at 19%, had a 2% increase in fourth quarter PC sales, and has been shipping more 10 nanometer parts. The company is losing some of its market share and volume to AMD, but the interesting thing here is it hasn't really quite materialized yet in these numbers. So there's two things at play. One, Intel is an impossibly large company, and it works in a lot of segments other than PC desktop, especially other than enthusiasts. So enthusiast market is, I don't know how small it is, but it's tiny. It is not a big market. Servers where it's at in terms of CPUs, and they are starting to lose some volume there, but the money hasn't really shown that yet. So there might be a latent impact where Intel's big enough, it's got enough other things going on that you're not going to see this AMD hit for a while yet. And you've got some really interesting curiosities too, where some of the server providers who have had actual impact from security vulnerability updates because they work in a world where the mitigations have hurt performance more than we'd see in gaming, for example. Some of those companies end up buying more Intel CPUs to make up for the mitigation impact of performance. So Intel kind of wins twice when that happens, as opposed to going and buying Epic or something like that, because it doesn't work for every application. Xeon is ramping up really quickly right now for the applications that make use of it. So Epic's not a one-size-fits-all solution, which means that Intel's still showing good numbers overall. Asus finally releases a CES 2018 product. If you ever watch show coverage and think this is all vaporware anyway, what's the point? Well, you're not always wrong. But in this instance, you'd be wrong, except it took 2 years for that to be an inaccurate statement. We did what we thought would be some throwaway coverage in 2018 and looked at the Asus bezel-free triple monitor display setup, where it uses a lens to try and obfuscate the black bezel between the three monitors. And at the time, that video did really well relative to our channel's performance. We never quite understood why, but it got some viewership. And Asus basically made two lenses that sit between the borders of the left and right of center monitor. You could also use this with a two display setup. And Asus made the lenses work optimally at 130-degree angle, so they do have to be precisely positioned, and it allows most of the light through. So it was an interesting idea for a show product, but ultimately you kind of look at it and it's like, okay, well, that's a lens. But the kit is available now, and there was a lot of interest in it, so we wanted to bring it back up. It wasn't just vaporware. It's the Asus ROG bezel-free ABF01. It doesn't have great Amazon reviews right now, and it costs $110 for two lenses, with some of that pricing definitely being because Asus knows that owners of three large displays can spend $110 on some lenses. So that's up there now if you wanted it. Opera, allegedly involved in predatory lending. Opera, the web browser, actually was one of the first web browsers I used. And personally speaking, I don't know, a couple decades ago, whenever it was sort of still fully independent and not built on Chromium, it was a leading browser. You could buy Opera at Radio Shack for $19.99 on a CD, and that's what I did. So I used to love Opera, but it's changed a lot. It's really fallen off, and the other browsers have gotten more competitive. I've dropped it years ago. Anyway, since its IPO in 2018, browser maker Opera has been trying to expand outside of its core product, especially in the wake of declining revenue from the browser business in general. In recent years, the company has pivoted to the lending business. While that might seem innocuous enough, although odd for a browser company, a new report from Hindenburg Research suggests that it's not really so innocuous, and also that they've got some pretty damning evidence. The Hindenburg report details Opera's lending business and sums it up as predatory short-term lending through a number of Android apps on the Google Play Store. The apps in question are OKAsh and Opesa in Kenya, Cashbean in India, and OPay in Nigeria, all seeming to serve areas where credit cards or more conventional loans are uncommon, hence predatory. The report alleges that in some cases the apps would advertise a maximum annual percentage rate, APR, of 33% or less, but then the APR would ratchet up to as much as 438% in some cases. Meanwhile, the loan terms were advertised as anywhere from 91 to 365 days. They purportedly end up being much shorter, anywhere from 29 to 15 days. And if borrowers were to miss payments, interest rates soared to as much as 867%, while the app pillaged the user's phone for contacts to harass. All of these actions alone are in violation of Google's Play Store policy regarding predatory lending apps, which are in place to protect users from deceptive and exploitative lending practices. Google requires at least a 60-day term. It requires full disclosure of all interest rates, and it requires an example of the total cost of the loan. Opera has unsurprisingly denied the research and findings in the report at present, and it's going so far as to say the report contains, quote, numerous errors, unsubstantiated statements, and misleading conclusions and interpretations. However, Opera has done little in the way of actually attempting to refute the findings with data. Meanwhile, Hindenburg has stood by its research and has produced data for analysis. In the very least, even if none of this, if Opera is correct that it has, well, they didn't say the report is outright false, but if they're correct that it has misinterpretations, the real takeaway is that the Opera web browser still exists, and it's not on a CD anymore. Yeah, we'll leave that there. ASML expects to ship 35 EUV systems in 2020. Almost misread that as ASMR, and I really don't want ASMR computer hardware. ASML, the world's largest lithography equipment supplier, recently revealed in an earnings call that the company expects to ship 35 EUV systems in 2020. ASML has already delivered 26 EUV systems for 2019 as fabs continue to make progress with EUV, and ASML has also set a lofty goal of raising EUV equipment sales by 40% annually, with a forecast of 45 to 50 EUV systems delivered in 2021. Presently, TSMC is leading the charge at the 7nm level, with its N7 Plus node being the first to use EUV. TSMC's previous N7 node relied on deep ultraviolet lithography, and the N7 Plus process would see TSMC use extreme ultraviolet lithography on up to 4 layers. As semiconductors shrink beyond 7nm, EUV will play an increasingly important role, hence ASML's aggressive revenue goals for EUV equipment sales. ASML's current EUV system is the TwinScan NXE3400C, a successor to the TwinScan NXE3400B. The 3400C is geared for EUV volume production at 7nm and 5nm and offers a 300mm wafer throughput of 170 wafers per hour. This one's a rumor. This is the one that I genuinely, when reading through the show notes that Eric had prepared for me, did think that it said Intel expected to cut CPU prices in 2120. But it is second half of 2020, although given Intel's reluctance to cut prices, that's not totally unbelievable. A report from Digitimes claims that Intel is planning to cut its CPU prices at some point in the second half of this year. There are already some reductions towards the end of 2019 on certain products. Some of the enthusiast SKUs were supposed to come down a little bit in price. And of course, the 10980XE came down about $1,000 from its immediate predecessor and the predecessor before that, actually. No doubt, some of this is in anticipation of AMD's Zen 3 architecture. That's been in the news lately, mostly rumors at this point. A price cut is often a rare move for Intel, but at this point, it's one of its only cards left to play, and it's one that it should use to get some market back and get some interest again from the enthusiast audience. Intel famously cut pricing for its Cascade Lake X parts across the stack for last year as a last-ditch effort to take some of the shine away from AMD's Threadripper 3000. This is a move that Intel wouldn't have even dreamed of a few short years ago, but the market's changed substantially. In the meantime, despite its once ironclad grip on the desktop and enthusiast segments, AMD is working on its Ryzen 4000 laptops and is working, which by the way don't have Zen 3, just to be clear there, and is working towards Zen 3 architecture for its desktops in the immediate future. So while these price cuts ultimately couldn't save Intel from Threadripper 3000, they do need to try and plan to save their processors from the next AMD onslaught. We can assume that the rumored price cuts Intel could be plotting are for Comet Lake S, and those are supposed to be more 14 nanometer CPUs if you weren't familiar. Intel will have to lean on those until its 10 nanometer silicon for desktop arrives next year at this point for the roadmap. It's also probably yet another line of CPUs Intel won't be able to keep on the shelves due to the pervasive 14 nanometer CPU shortage that we've been covering for, it feels like, over a year at this point. So we'll see. This one's a bit of a rumor. So Intel ATX12VO PSU specification. Since the mid-90s, the power supply really hasn't changed much, with the exception of ever higher efficiency ratings, some of them being created recently, like titanium. And one of the things that we heard years and years ago, and speaking with some engineers at a power supply company, was that the 5 volt and the 3.3 volt lines might start moving away at some point. It hasn't happened yet, but as it turns out, according to a report from Custom PC, Intel is planning to introduce a new ATX12VO specification at some point this year. The specification, as you might expect, stands for ATX 12 volts only, and it sounds, well, if true, it would be the biggest change to power supply design for computers as we use them in years. There are 12 volt only power supplies, but a lot of those were for mining. There's some for specific server applications, things like that. So this would be different for the enthusiast segment. It's not groundbreaking or far-fetched. A 12 volt only power supply design would initially roll out to system integrators who want to streamline product offerings for retail channels, as well as reduce costs for power supplies and components. A power supply bereft of dedicated 5 volt and 3.3 volt rails could still power components that only rely on lower voltages with a step-down DC transformer. Some call this a DC to DC converter. They're the same thing. They take a primary higher operating voltage and transform it down to a lower secondary voltage. Most power supplies have these anyway. Alternatively, the motherboards could also handle the voltage conversion for things like SATA and USB. The ATX 12 volt only standard would purportedly eschew the 24-pin ATX connector for a more trim 10-pin connector, with an EPS connector for high-power systems or overclockers being optional. Again, the new standard seems mostly aimed at SIs and OEMs, so the DIY PC scene is likely not going to change much, assuming the veracity of the report. Despite some positive news for Intel and its server, well, actually just its revenue in general, earlier in this news video, HPE expects Xeon shortages to endure all year. Intel has been battling CPU shortages for well over a year and a half now, and though Intel continues to insist that those shortages will recede sometime in the near future, and at this point, the second half of the year, there's at least one of Intel's partners that isn't convinced, and that's HPE. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise has issued a warning to its server customers, stating that it expects Intel Xeon shortages, Cascade Lake in particular, to last throughout all of 2020. And in a statement to the Register, HPE said the following, quote, "Based on demand, we are expecting supply will remain constrained through 2020. Server platforms which use these processors are affected. In order to minimize customer impact as a result of these supply constraints with Cascade Lake processors, HPE urges customers to consider alternative processors which are still available. We are in constant dialogue with our partners at Intel and have a strong relationship with them, and we know that they are working on the issue." According to the Register, Intel's Xeon Silver processor series, the 42XX, are among the tightest in supply right now, which predominantly affects the following HPE server platforms. There's the ProLiant DL360, ML350, BL460, Apollo 4200, Synergy 480, and a couple of others. HPE's current internal guidance to steer customers towards Skylake SP Xeons as SOP right now. 14 nanometer chips for those date back to 2017. So they're pushing some of the older stuff to keep people at least running for now. Staying on Windows 7 will apparently cost Germany $887,000. As it turns out, a really great way to burn through $887,000 is to just not migrate 33,000 Windows 7 machines to a new OS. Good news if you're Microsoft, especially with the new carbon negative plan that we covered last episode, and not such good news if you're Germany. According to reports, the German Federal Ministry has no less than 33,000 PCs running Windows 7. I should state that this is not uncommon. There are computers almost certainly running Windows XP and maybe even 3.1 in the US government somewhere. We've seen a lot of Windows XP machines in the field for manufacturing as well, but that's a bit different than government deployment. Either way, in case like Germany, you missed it somehow, Windows 7 technically went dark on January 14th of 2020. It's now EOL status. It won't receive updates or security patches. I still have it on one of my machines. However, business customers do have the privilege of paying for extended support, albeit for a finite time. It's up to 3 years extended, and that ends on January 10th, 2023 at exponentially rising costs each year. Germany is set to pay Microsoft somewhere between $25 and $50 per machine, which is exactly what Microsoft charges depending on the version of Windows 7 in use. And reports didn't mention that what Germany plans for 2021, but we would assume it would involve making the move to Windows 10 to at least bring down the cost a bit, or perhaps a distro of Linux is in order. That'd be cool. Or you could just continue to run an unsupported OS like Russia is with Windows XP. And I mean, the worst that could happen is dormant WannaCry crypto worms sitting on your government computer with a kill switch to infect exploitable operating systems in the event of an internet outage. Nope, that's not a thing. One more story came up right as we were editing the news video, so we'll add that in. A recent story originating from XFastest got traction on the web, but AMD has addressed the product as being counterfeit. The short of this story is that there were claims of a new AMD stock cooler coming to market with the insinuation that a silent switchover from the original stock cooler to this newer, allegedly better one would start applying to new orders. We personally saw AMD's coolers being made at Cooler Master's factory about a year ago, and it's our understanding that Cooler Master does not make the counterfeits found on XFastest. It's maybe another factory moonlighting or just copying the design really closely. The photos indicated one key difference, which was a 6 heat pipe design rather than the 4 heat pipe design that you'd find on Cooler Master's factory floor. Theoretically, this would be better if all else is completely equal, but AMD has issued a statement on the matter to PC Gamer. AMD told PC Gamer the following, quote, "It has come to our attention that third-party coolers using 6 heat pipes that are designed to look like an official AMD Wraith Prism solution, including the illegitimate use of AMD branding, are now entering the market. Please be aware that those solutions are not genuine AMD products and have not been tested or validated by AMD to meet our build quality and performance requirements. We are actively investigating the source of these products and will take the necessary actions to enforce our rights to ensure users receive genuine AMD products. If you have any questions about the order of a cooler, you can verify the solution on AMD's website." Of course, it's sensible that AMD would pursue the misuse of its assets, as any company would, but the likelihood of that having any bearing on a factory in China that's ripping off the design is zero. One point of concern would be whether the CPUs being sold with these coolers, if there are any being sold with them as a bundle, are also valid, because it's possible to spoof CPUs. It's been done in the past, and that's where the change gets more costly rather than just a cooler where it might even be slightly better. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus for some extra videos. I'll see you all next time.